When you walk away, the first thing that occurs is not heartbreak in the way most people imagine it. What emerges instead is shock, a deep psychological disorientation. For a narcissistic woman, identity is not something stable and internally grounded. It is constructed moment by moment through external validation, control, and reflection from others. You are not simply a partner. You are a stabilizing mirror. When that mirror disappears without warning, the psyche experiences a sudden collapse in coherence. At this stage, she struggles to process the reality of your absence. There is disbelief, even a sense of unreality, as if the situation itself must be temporary or reversible. This is why early reactions often appear contradictory. Dismissive one moment, frantic the next. Internally, the mind is racing to restore equilibrium, not through understanding, but through control. The loss is not interpreted as rejection of the relationship, but as a violation of an unspoken psychological contract that you were meant to remain accessible. Philosophically speaking, this is the moment when the ego encounters its limits. The narcissistic structure depends on predictability, on knowing how others will respond, return, and submit. Your departure introduces the one thing the narcissistic psyche cannot tolerate: uncertainty. And uncertainty feels like annihilation. The shock is not emotional pain in the traditional sense. It is the terror of losing dominance over one's narrative and identity. This is why the earliest stage is so volatile. Attempts to reassert control may follow quickly, or there may be a cold withdrawal masked as indifference. Both are defenses against the same threat, the realization that something essential has slipped beyond reach. And here lies the deeper truth worth remembering. The moment you chose to walk away, you didn't just leave a relationship. You disrupted a psychological system that depended on your presence to function. After the initial shock fades, it does not give way to reflection or sorrow. It hardens into something far more volatile: ego injury. This is the moment when the narcissistic woman begins to feel regret, but not in the moral sense. What arises is a silent rage, a corrosive awareness that her authority over the emotional field has been challenged. The departure is no longer unreal, it is now personal. In psychological terms, this is a wound to the self-image. Narcissism relies on the fantasy of being indispensable, admired, and irreplaceable. Your absence contradicts that fantasy. And because this contradiction cannot be resolved through introspection, it is experienced as an attack. Regret at this stage is not about what was lost emotionally, but about what was taken symbolically: access to validation, influence, and control. This is why anger often replaces longing. The mind reframes the story to protect itself. You may be recast as ungrateful, weak, or disloyal, not because this is true, but because it restores a sense of superiority. Beneath that narrative, however, lies obsession. The psyche circles the same question again and again: how could this happen to me? The regret is sharp, but it is inverted, aimed outward rather than inward. Philosophically, this stage reveals a deeper conflict between image and reality. The ego demands to be untouchable, yet reality has proven otherwise. That gap produces resentment, not humility. And so the narcissistic structure doubles down, clinging more tightly to its defenses while internally simmering with unresolved loss. For you, this stage carries an important lesson. The anger you may sense from a distance is not strength. It is the sound of an identity struggling to repair itself without the reflection it once relied upon. And that is precisely why your silence becomes so powerful. It denies the wounded ego the reaction it needs to survive. After resentment takes hold, the psyche seeks relief, not through understanding, but through substitution. This is where the illusion of replacement emerges. On the surface, it may appear that she has moved on effortlessly: new connections, renewed confidence, carefully displayed happiness. But psychologically, this is not healing, it is anesthesia. The new presence is not chosen for intimacy, but for function. Its role is to silence the echo left by your absence. From a Jungian perspective, This stage is driven by the ego's desperate attempt to restore its wounded image. If she can prove to herself and to the outside world that you were easily replaceable, then the injury never truly happened. Yet the unconscious does not cooperate so easily. Comparison begins almost immediately. Every new source of attention is measured against what once existed, not because of emotional attachment, but because the psyche remembers what stabilized it. This is where regret becomes subtle but persistent. It is no longer explosive, it is comparative. The replacement may provide novelty, but novelty lacks depth. Admiration without attunement quickly feels hollow. And while she may appear energized, there is an underlying restlessness, a sense that something essential is missing but cannot be named without confronting loss. Philosophically, this stage exposes the difference between possession and connection. Possession can be replaced endlessly. Connection cannot. The narcissistic structure confuses the two, believing that quantity can substitute for quality. But over time, the psyche recognizes the absence of something irreplaceable, a stable reflection that did not collapse under pressure. For you, this is the moment where clarity matters most. What looks like your erasure is often proof of your impact. The speed of replacement is not evidence of indifference, but of avoidance. And the deeper insight is this: when someone must constantly prove they were unaffected, it is usually because they were affected more than they can afford to admit. As time passes and the illusion of replacement begins to lose its power, something far more uncomfortable sets in: comparison that can no longer be avoided. The new sources of validation fail to provide same psychological stability, and the mind is forced to reckon with a quiet realization. What was lost was not merely attention, but a specific emotional structure that cannot be recreated on demand. This is where regret turns inward, not into accountability, but into recognition. The narcissistic psyche begins to sense that something meaningful slipped away, not because it was perfect, but because it functioned. You may have offered consistency, emotional regulation, or a grounding presence that helped organize her inner world. Without it, chaos feels closer to the surface. And this creates a subtle but persistent discomfort that no external admiration can fully soothe. From a Jungian lens, this stage represents a confrontation with the shadow. The shadow contains what the ego refuses to acknowledge: dependence, vulnerability, and limitation. To admit regret openly would mean admitting reliance on another, which threatens the narcissistic self-image. So the regret remains internal, unspoken, and unresolved, manifesting as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or quiet bitterness. Philosophically, this is the moment where reality asserts itself over fantasy. The fantasy said you were interchangeable. Reality reveals that you were not. And this realization does not inspire growth. It inspires mourning for an idealized self that believed it was beyond loss. For you, this stage is a turning point. You may never hear this regret expressed, but it exists in the absence you now occupy. Why? The most powerful thing you can do is not to wait for acknowledgement, but to recognize the value you carried without needing it affirmed. The reflection to take with you is simple yet profound. When your absence forces someone to confront what they cannot replace, it is proof that walking away was not abandonment. It was self-respect made visible. When regret deepens and remains unresolved, it often seeks expression, not through honesty, but through return. This is the stage where contact reappears, often disguised as concern, nostalgia, or the desire for closure. But psychologically, this is not about reconnection, it is about reclamation. The narcissistic psyche is attempting to soothe an old wound by restoring access to what once stabilized it: your attention, your responsiveness, your emotional availability. From the outside, this may look like growth. The tone may be softer, reflective, even remorseful. Yet beneath the language lies the same unresolved dynamic. True reflection requires accepting responsibility without expectation. What happens here is strategic vulnerability. carefully measured expressions designed to reopen the channel without confronting the deeper causes of the rupture. In Jungian terms, this is the ego attempting to renegotiate reality rather than transform itself. The unconscious has registered loss, but the conscious mind seeks relief without surrender. By pulling you back into orbit, even briefly, the psyche regains a sense of influence. Whether the outcome is reconciliation, rejection, or confusion matters less than the momentary restoration of control. This is why such contact often feels disorienting. It awakens old emotional patterns while offering little genuine change. And if you respond, even with boundaries, the ego reads it as proof that the connection, and therefore the power dynamic, was never truly lost. Philosophically, this stage reveals the difference between healing and soothing. Healing demands discomfort, humility, and sustained effort. Soothing only demands access. The narcissistic structure seeks the latter because the former would require dismantling the very identity it has spent years defending. For you, this is the moment where clarity becomes action. You are not being contacted because the past has been understood, but because it has not been resolved. And the insight to carry forward is this: closure is not something someone gives you. It is something you protect by refusing to re-enter a dynamic that already showed you its limits. Eventually, the cycle exhausts itself. When reclamation fails or loses its effectiveness, the psyche arrives at its final position, not resolution, but accommodation. This is where regret either settles quietly into the background or hardens into emotional numbness. The narcissistic structure does not easily integrate loss. It learns instead how to live around it. The absence remains, but it is no longer confronted directly. In some cases, regret becomes a silent companion. It is never articulated, never processed, but privately acknowledged in moments of comparison or solitude. In others, the psyche chooses detachment as a defense. Emotional flattening replaces longing, not because healing has occurred, but because feeling has become too threatening. This numbness is not peace, it is insulation. From a Jungian perspective, this stage reflects a refusal of individuation. True psychological growth would require integrating the loss, accepting limitation, and allowing the ego to be reshaped by experience. Instead, the narcissistic psyche preserves itself by narrowing emotional range. The wound is not healed, it is sealed off. And what is sealed off continues to exert pressure from beneath the surface. Philosophically, this outcome reveals a sobering truth. Regret does not always lead to wisdom. Without conscious reflection, experience merely accumulates. It does not transform. The loss becomes part of the unconscious narrative, influencing future relationships in subtle, repetitive ways. For you, this final stage offers the clearest confirmation. The silence that follows is not indifference, and it is not closure granted by the other. It is the end of a cycle that no longer requires your participation. Your role was never to save, fix, or awaken someone who could not face themselves. The lasting insight is this: walking away did not end the story. It ended your involvement in a pattern that demanded your presence but denied your humanity. And that choice, more than any reaction you never received, is the truest form of freedom.